Fighters from the armed group Islamic State seized Syria's main oil and gas fields, driving out rival rebels and dividing opposition groups. But is the Al-Qaeda offshoot undermining the revolution against President Bashar al-Assad? Hello, I'm Folly Bah Thibault. Welcome to this edition of Inside Syria. The group formerly known as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL, says it's in full control of all of Syria's main oil and gas fields. This video posted to a social media website appears to show Islamic State fighters outside the Al-Olma oil field in Deir ez-Zor province. They say they seized it from rivals the Alnusra Front. It's further strengthening the Islamic State's advance across eastern Syria and reinforcing its stated goal of establishing a caliphate or Islamic system of rule straddling Syria and Iraq. While Islamic State is now considered to be the most potent rebel group in Syria, with rivals complaining that it spends more time fighting them than Syrian government forces. So much so that groups in northern and eastern Syria have threatened to lay down their weapons unless they get reinforcements from exiled opposition leaders. In a statement released on Wednesday, they said, "We, the leaders of the brigades and battalions, give the National Coalition, the interim government, the Supreme Military Council and all the leading bodies of the Syrian revolution a week to send reinforcements and complete aid." It went on to say, should our call not be heard, we will lay down our weapons and pull out our fighters, and added, our popular revolution is today under threat because of the Islamic State. Well, let me introduce now our guests for this edition of Inside Syria. In London, we have Shiraz Maher, Senior Research Fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalisation with King's College London. In Philadelphia, in the United States, Isabel Nassief, a research analyst at the Institute for the Study of War. And also in London, Abdullah Al Andalusi, a political analyst and Islamic Affairs Specialist. Thank you all for being on this edition of Inside Syria. Isabel, if I can start with you, is ISIL pretty much the only game in town now today in Syria?
Well, it's certainly become one of the biggest ones. I mean, clashes throughout the country continue between rebel groups and the regime, but certainly there's a lot of focus by both rebels and the regime now to fight ISIS in eastern Syria. Previous to the fall of Mosul in Iraq, we did not see the regime target ISIS with airstrikes the way it has been doing in eastern Syria, so it's definitely become a focus for them in the way it hasn't before.
What is left of the Free Syrian Army?
Elements of the Free Syrian Army, so moderate rebel groups associated with the Supreme Military Council, are still fighting throughout Syria. They're particularly strong in Deraa, in southern Syria. There's a new offensive along the Lebanese border in Kalamoun. They're fighting the regime in Aleppo city. Obviously largely integrated with groups like Harakat Ahrar al-Sham and Jabhat al-Nusra, but they're still fighting the regime. They're still fighting the regime, you say, but it seems that some of the fighters anyway say that ISIL and the Islamic State, whatever they're calling themselves, the Islamic State today, have undermined the revolution against Bashar al-Assad. Shiraz Maher, do you agree with that? To what extent have they undermined this revolution against the Assad regime?
We need to contextualize their aims against what the Free Syrian Army or some of the other rebel groups are trying to achieve in Syria. So it's very difficult to talk about, the opposition in Syria. You have secular or liberal rebels who are attempting to fight the regime, who want to remove Assad. That's not what ISIS is about. Assad is part of the process, but they are fundamentally engaged in the process of state building, and that's their real interest. What they're about is creating a separate entity, which they now claim to have established, the caliphate, which straddles both Syria and Iraq. And so for them, taking out Assad or taking out Maliki are sort of, they are surprises, but ultimately they're side goals to what they wanted to establish, which is a state. Side goals,
you say. Abdullah Al Andalusi, do you agree with that? And do you think we can even talk about a revolution in Syria when you have all these different groups that are fighting each other now?
Yes, the conflicting groups in Syria is counterproductive to the overall goals of deposing the dictator, the secular dictator Bashar al-Assad. The majority of the rebel groups in Syria do want an Islamic regime. They have said so. They have called for an Islamic state. ISIS are basically trying to claim authority as being the sole movement, trying to absorb other movements by force if necessary. And their claim to be an Islamic state, or their claim now to be a caliphate, is is just an attempt for them to unilaterally assert their authority as the only group, and they have basically to that end led to conflict with other groups which also want an Islamic state. The majority of the rebels in the north want an Islamic regime, but as to whether it's the ISIS way or the ISIS leadership is a different question, and this is where the problems are arising between these groups.
Just how significant is it that they were able to capture the Omar oil field, Syria's largest and most important oil field, without any major resistance from the other groups that are in the area, and it seems without resistance even from the Syrian government itself?
Well, I mean, we have to look at it in the context and also in history. There are reports that Bashar al-Assad has been very lenient on the ISIS-controlled areas, not bombing them as much as the other rebel areas, and even... Well, I think because ISIS, in a way, conveniently suits Bashar al-Assad's aims, which is to divide your opposition and have them infighting. While most of the opposition have been focused on fighting the Syrian army, ISIS has been predominantly focused on fighting other rebels. This suits Bashar al-Assad's aims completely, which is to divide and conquer, and it has been effective to some degree.
Isabel, do you agree with that? Does ISIS really suit Bashar al-Assad's aim, and what is the strategy of the Syrian government in dealing with this group?
Yes, I absolutely agree. One of the key indicators for this is that the regime's presence in eastern Syria in Deir ez-Zor is limited, and clashes between the regime and ISIS really never happened in that area. As soon as ISIS was resurgent in Iraq and seized Mosul, all of a sudden there were a lot of Syrian regime airstrikes against ISIS headquarters in al-Raqqa and in Deir ez-Zor. And I would put this in the context of Iran's overall strategy in this and their interest in counteracting ISIS in Syria now that it is resurgent in Iraq, which was not previously the case.
Shiraz, what is your view on that particular point of the different groups now seem to have lost control, as we've been saying, and Bashar al-Assad is now having to deal with this just one big group that is gaining a lot of force, not just in Syria, but in Iraq as well?
Well, I think what both of the contributors broadly get the point right here, which is if you're Assad, it makes sense to not have focused on ISIS so much at this moment in time. Assad knows there are two things he needs to do. He needs to take Aleppo back. He wants to concentrate his efforts there, concentrate his limited resources on trying to take back that city. ISIS is a problem for him, but it's a problem that he can fight another day because of two reasons. One, it's confined to the east of the country. It's not in the heartlands. And the second point is that he knows international public opinion is so strongly arrayed against ISIS that the West won't really condemn him for taking them on. So in that sense, it's a problem that could be delayed. It's the issue for him now is that they've built up such a head of steam, as you mentioned. They've gone into Iraq. They've taken a huge number of resources in terms of oil fields, gas sites, which is generating a huge deal of revenue for them. And so from that perspective now, they're becoming a beast that increasingly needs confrontation.
Well, let's talk about the feud between these different groups that are fighting in Syria right now. The split and the subsequent feud between the Alnusra Front and ISIL is in many ways a battle of wills between two of Al-Qaeda's top fighters. One of them is this man, Abu Muhammad al-Golani, a veteran of the war against the Americans in Iraq. He was dispatched to Syria by the head of the Al-Qaeda in Iraq to set up an affiliate, Al-Nusra Front. The group built a reputation as a disciplined fighting force responsible for some of the most audacious attacks against the Syrian regime. In April 2013, the head of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, announced a merger under the banner of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. Golani rejected his former boss's grand plan, as did Al-Qaeda's chief Ayman al-Zawahiri. But Baghdadi ignored them, and al-Nusra broke away, setting the tone for the infighting going on now. So let me ask you, Abdullah, in London, do you think we'll see the different groups that are fighting in Iraq right now all end up pledging allegiance to ISIS?
I don't entirely think that will be the case, mainly because there are quite a few different factions. You have the Western-backed and supported Free Syrian Army, which are patently secular. They're not very well liked amongst the Islamic-based groups, which form the majority of the rebels. But there are infighting between these rebel groups. Now, it does depend. ISIS right now are being promoted by both Western media and in social media and by the regional media media as being the front of successful victories against the Iraqi regime and at least in controlling Syria. And a lot of Muslims, unfortunately, are attracted to success. So success talks rather than perhaps methodology or ideology. So they might get a lot of defectors to their cause. I mean, Jabhat al-Nusra made a pragmatic strategy to align itself with Al-Qaeda just to get resources internationally, but they are very well liked within Syria. It's unfortunate they align themselves with Al-Qaeda, but they don't use the same methodology as Al-Qaeda traditionally does. They don't call for a global jihad, or they don't call for they don't use attacks against civilians as their main strategy. So whether the Muslims, I mean, in Iraq and Syria will both agree as to what their view towards ISIS will be is also going to be a question as well, because the Iraqi northern insurgents, some might dislike ISIS, some might have an alliance of convenience, right. But a lot of them are attracted to ISIS, whereas in Syria there's quite a lot of dislike to ISIS from some of the reports that I've been hearing. So it will vary between region.
Why the fallout in the first place? Tell us more about that, the fallout between the Alnusra Front and ISIL. Why the fallout, and do their ideologies differ that much?
Well, I think the point that you were making is the correct one. The history is very important. Once Jabhat al-Nusra was established, they were no longer willing to submit themselves to ISIS once they moved into the Syrian conflict. And the dispute became pretty bitter, with Zawahiri as well calling on ISIS to pull back, for them to focus on Iraq, to leave Syria to Jabhat al-Nusra. Sheikh Adnani, the spokesman for ISIS, issued a very, very stinging rebuke actually to Zawahiri. It actually never gets discussed enough, but I think it's quite unprecedented in terms of the internal discourse that's happened within the global jihadi movement. He essentially told Zawahiri, he said, that it was his fault that Al-Qaeda hadn't taken advantage of the uprisings in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, that they didn't have more of an Islamic character as they would have liked it. And they said that as a result of that, they weren't about to pass up the opportunity that was present on their doorstep inside Syria. And they went a step further to say, you know, why is Zawahiri calling on them to recognize these borders that have been put in by imperialists? They said, we don't recognize this as a border that we should adhere to. The conflict in Syria, the conflict in Iraq, they're one and the same thing. It's the same war, it's the same battle. Therefore, you don't have the right to tell us not to go into this. And in that sense, they are carrying on the tradition of Zarqawi, who of course established Al-Qaeda in Iraq, where he set up the principle that proximity gives you primacy. When they told him to calm down, to not fight the Shia in such a vehement fashion, he told them, look, I'm on the ground, I know what I'm doing, you're far away, let me get on with it. And that's exactly what ISIS has done now as well.
But do you think, Isabel, that they'll be able to reconcile? I mean, these they have different objectives, or do they have the same objective today? Or do you think that it's pretty much all over now, that we'll continue seeing all these different groups, you know, with different objectives across Syria and Iraq? Yeah,
I mean, ISIS has, as long as ISIS is as strong as it is now, it really has no incentive to reconcile with Zawahiri and the larger Al-Qaeda movement. As the other contributors have pointed out, there really are two competing ideologies right now about how to, you know, how to become powerful and how to conduct operations. And it's manifesting in Syria, where JN is far more sophisticated and embedded within the country, while ISIS is far more brutal in the way that it does that.
Abdullah, what more do we know about this group, ISIL? Do we know who is funding it today? Where there's been reports that there are foreign fighters among them, that their local leader in Syria is said to be a man from Georgia known as Abu al-Shishani, the Chechen. How many foreigners make up this group, and where do they get their funding from?
Well, if you refer to people who are non-Syrian, basically they're mostly Iraqi, the ISIS group. Their funding is, ironically enough, a lot of it is from Bashar al-Assad via oil sales to the Syrian regime. They make money from these oil fields by selling the oil to the Syrian regime. They also have a lot of independent backers. There are no real states that really back ISIS.
What about Nouri al-Maliki's accusations that they're being funded by some Saudis?
They'll probably be funded by a lot of Saudi private citizens, no doubt, but certainly not by the Saudi regime, which has outlawed anyone in Saudi Arabia from basically encouraging people to go to fight in Syria and Iraq, and has outlawed groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, which are not even jihadi groups. So I don't think Saudi Arabia has any interest in funding ISIS, which ultimately wants to see Saudi Arabia deposed. But rather what you might find is independent individuals which are attracted to the Islamic, but due to an Islamic perceived Islamic cause, funding ISIS, believing that yes, they are successful, they are defending the rights of Muslims in Iraq and Syria, and also that they are calling for an Islamic state. While these causes are legitimate, as to whether ISIS truly embodies them in the correct way and the correct Islamic way is a different question.
Shiraz, do you think the Saudis really aren't involved in the Sunni rebellion in Iraq?
Well, the Saudis aren't involved in an official capacity in terms of supporting ISIS. It doesn't work for them. That group is a threat to them as well. It wants to take them out. But I think there is clear that there is an informal private donor network which does get money out to ISIS. It doesn't account for the overwhelming majority of its revenues, though. The revenue is by and large coming from the fact that ISIS has been incredibly strategic. It's targeted key resource areas, taking oil fields, gas fields, and taking industrial areas as well. And it has the ability to sell that back. So official support for the group is very low. There's no governments out there who are backing the organization. But that, in a sense, actually is the triumph of this group, that it is able to operate independently and yet generate such huge amounts of revenue, generate a degree of goodwill amongst its supporters. It has a huge online community of supporters who are very vociferous in its defense. It attracts foreign fighters, as you mentioned. It has really benefited from them coming into the group. And so it is functioning to a large extent as independently as it possibly could. Abdullah
mentioned that they get their resources from the oil revenue. How does it exactly work? I mean, between them and the Assad government? Is that what you're saying, Abdullah?
Yes, I mean, there are many reports whereby they've actually sold oil to the Assad regime in return for money. This shows that their priority in Syria is not the toppling of the Assad regime per se, but rather just accruing power, which is why that they have no problem in switching their targets from the Syrian army to their fellow rebels. I think to them it's ISIS versus the world, as opposed to ISIS necessarily just versus the Syrian regime, and they're able to be pragmatic in that sense, whereas other rebel groups would not truck to have any dealings with the Syrian regime, certainly giving them oil which goes into their tanks and their fighter jets that bombs the Syrian people. So it clearly shows there's a different priorities with the Islamic Syrian rebels and the ISIS rebels.
Well, in the meantime, US President Barack Obama is proposing to commit $500 million on training and equipping what the White House has called appropriately vetted elements of the moderate Syrian armed opposition. The statement said the assistance was intended to help defend the Syrian people, stabilize areas under opposition control, facilitate the provision of essential services, counter terrorist threats, and promote conditions for a negotiated settlement. Isabel, what do you make of this U.S. decision to fund and train the so-called moderate opposition in Syria? In light of what's been happening in Iraq, do you think it was time that we saw more U.S. involvement, or is it too little too late?
I think it's it would have been nice if it had happened sooner, but it's the most threatening thing to ISIS is a mobilized and powerful Sunni force, and to the extent that this funding can help build and train the moderate opposition, I think it's an important move.
But who is the moderate opposition in Syria today?
Currently the U.S. is training elements of the moderate opposition particularly in southern Syria. There are groups that still exist on a local level, although the majority of the opposition does seem to, or the most powerful elements of the opposition are alliances such as the Islamic Front. There are groups there that the U.S. has been working with and can work with, groups like Harakat Hazm, which has had U.S.-supported tow missiles.
Shiraz, do you agree with that? Do you think there's a moderate opposition today that the U.S. can work with, that the U.S. can train and help without having to worry about them using the training and the weapons, without having to worry that those weapons will fall into the wrong hands?
There's always been a moderate opposition on the ground in Syria. It's always been an indigenous opposition as well, which I think is one of its key strengths. The problem is they have been betrayed by the West. They've never been supported properly. They've never been given resources. And that's had two problems. One, it's sucked momentum away from them. It's empowered other groups because they have momentum, they have the resources. And it's meant that a lot of fighters defected, not for ideological reasons, not for principal reasons, but because if you're fighting at the end of the day and you have Group A, which you don't necessarily agree with, but they're going to give you the best kit, the best equipment in order for you to fulfill your aims, and Group B, who you're probably more closely aligned to, but they don't have that capacity, then you're probably going to go with the former of those two things. So for the West to now go in and start doing this, it really is unfortunate that it's taken so long. I fear it's going to be too little too late, because the groups like ISIS have become so embedded, they've become so strong that beginning the process of trying to build a counterweight to them within the opposition side of things in Syria is going to be a long process. It's not going to deliver quick results.
Abdullah, do you agree with Shiraz when he says it's too little too late, that there's nothing really that the West can do now that would change the situation on the ground?
Well, to an extent, it is too little, too late. I don't think that Western intervention is helpful, especially when most of the intervention have been to interdict many legitimate groups in Syria, and obviously to declare some who are as terrorists. What the West doesn't want to see, or rather what America and most of Britain does not want to see, is an Islamic regime in Syria. The people in Syria, there's a lot of support for Islamic State and a caliphate, not ISIS's understanding or methodology, but rather one which comes from indigenously. But the US and America, US and UK does not want to see that. So that's why they've been dithering, because most of the opposition actually desires an Islamic regime.
Is there really support for a caliphate, and what would it look like anyway? Is there support for a caliphate in Syria today among those who are fighting against the Assad government?
Well, I mean, if you just listen to what their kind of the end goals of a lot of these groups have stated, which is that they want an Islamic regime, they want Sharia, because they believe that Sharia brings justice and freedom from arbitrary rule, whereas Bashar al-Assad was a secular dictator. So they want what the opposite of that. They don't want secular dictators anymore. They want rule by law, rule by Islamic law. This is what they've mostly said. This is why America has been dithering, because it doesn't want to support a regime change which brings in an Islamic regime. He wanted the FSA to be successful, but the Free Syrian Army are not the most popular group. They are reviled by many of the opposition forces as being a Western puppet. So the people want, there's been a lot of ground support for Islamic caliphate, and this is why ISIS have tried to unilaterally declare themselves a caliphate, because they want to attract that kind of legitimacy, because that's what they know the people want. But of course, the people know that while they want a caliphate, which is an elected leader implementing Islamic law, they don't want ISIS's methodology, which has been very brutal and intolerant.
Isabel, do you agree with that? Do you think there's a lot of ground support in Syria today for a caliphate?
I think that there's a lot of ground support in Syria for a form of Sharia law, an interpretation of it that is not as extreme as what ISIS is doing. I don't think that there's a lot of indigenous support in Syria for ISIS and the way that it is choosing to govern the areas that it has control over. Just last week there were protests against ISIS, and the groups that are pledging allegiance to ISIS, I believe, are doing it mostly out of fear of repercussions for not pledging allegiance to them.
Okay, Shiraz, you have the last word. How do you see the situation evolving in the coming weeks, in the coming months? I mean, ISIS, ISIL, the Islamic State, as they call themselves now, are becoming extremely strong in Syria, in Iraq as well. Will other groups, Sunni groups that are fighting in Iraq, for instance, join them? Or, you know, is this just much ado about nothing right now?
I think the most interesting thing that I've noted from observing the Islamic State is that they've been incredibly shrewd, very strategic. When the infighting started in January, really intensified towards the end of that month and in early February, they withdrew from a number of northern towns, from Assads, for example, because they wanted to consolidate their heartlands of Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, where they had a greater degree of control. Now that they've gone into Iraq, provided they keep that discipline, essentially, which is to consolidate that territory, they don't overstretch, but they continue to state build within that zone, I think they will continue to hold that land for quite some period of time, because they don't see a force, they don't see a power that can come in right now and tip the balance against them. And that's always been the key in the past, that where jihadist groups have held large bits of territory in Mali, for example, the French went in and toppled them. There's no one that can do that right now. The Iraqi government's incapable of doing it. The Syrian government's incapable of doing it. You essentially have two failed states and a new power that's in town. If they consolidate what they've got, I think their Islamic State will be here for some time.
Okay, we'll leave it on that note. Shiraz Maher and Abdullah Al Andalusi in London and Isabel Nassief in Philadelphia, thank you all for being on this edition of Inside Syria. Remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Syria on air and online. I'm Folly Bah Thibault. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.